Well, we just jumped out of the TARDIS, and we have a special guest with us. Please welcome to the podcast, Doctor Who fan, Matthew Kresal.
Hi, Matthew.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, how were you introduced to Doctor Who?
My introduction to Doctor Who came around May of 2000, I think it was. We had BBC America on DirecTV, and it used to be, I think it was at like 7 o'clock in the morning, they would rerun a couple of Tom Baker episodes every day. And one morning, home alone by myself, chilling out, sort of a summer between, I think it was 7th and 8th grade. Or was it 8th grade, 9th grade? I can't quite remember. But I happened to just be channel surfing one day looking for something to watch, and I came across what I now know was Planet of Evil Episode 4, the Tom Baker story. And I was just genuinely intrigued by it. I came in with 10 minutes left in it or something. So it was coming at the tail end of the story. So I didn't have a great idea what was going on. But it was just kind of like, this is really interesting, and I want to see more of this. And I tuned in, I think it was the next morning, and I saw the first half of Pyramids of Mars. And that was my introduction to it, really. I saw Pyramids of Mars, Seeds of Doom, Mask of Mandragora, and Hand of Fear, I think was the last one I saw. And I don't quite know what happened at that point. I don't know if they shifted the airing times to somewhere else, or they just completely stopped showing it. But I didn't see it again for a very long time. When I came across it again, it was, funnily enough, still through Classic Who rather than New Who. It was about January 2007. I was in a small-town public library here in Alabama, and I happened to come across The Five Doctors on DVD. And the library it was The Five Doctors, The Three Doctors, Seeds of Death, and The Key to Time season. And I kind of went, I vaguely remember this, and I started checking out the DVDs, and within a short time I was buying, DVDs and Big Finish audio. So that was very much my introduction. And even more weirdly, for somebody who came to it in the 21st century, I came to it through Classic Who rather than New Who.
That's great. And you were actually willing to get up early and watch it.
Well, my parents would drag me sort of out of bed. They were trying to keep me, I guess, on a regular sleep schedule so I wouldn't be completely messed up, when the school year started back in August. So they would get me up at like 6:30 in the morning. And they would leave for work about 6:45, 7 o'clock. So it was kind of like, okay, I'm up. I need something to do. But it was even more reason to, stay up instead of, going back to bed for an hour or two longer.
Right. Okay. And so what about Doctor Who did you find compelling?
I think it was just at the beginning, it was sort of the sense of history to it, because I came to it when I found it again through The Five Doctors. And it was suddenly this kind of awareness. It was like, wow, there's this show that ran. At that point, I didn't even know New Who existed. It was kind of like, okay, this clearly ran for quite a while. And there were, these DVDs branching it. And in watching those handful of DVDs out of that public library, it then became this sort of the sense of sort of variety to it, one story you could be on a frozen alien planet, and the next one it's a semi-comedic story written by Douglas Adams, and the next one it's a horror story basically. And it was just something that was just really compelling to sit down and watch, and the characters as well, because I came to it through The Five Doctors and The Three Doctors, so I instantly latched on to particularly John Pertwee's Doctor, but also Nicholas Courtney as the Brigadier. And they were very much my inroads into the show for a while. I became really fascinated with the Third Doctor era for a long time.
That's great, because, to be introduced with the Five Doctors, because it was such an awesome movie. And then you probably saw a lot of those doctors for the first time in that movie, right?
Yeah, it was the first time I saw Hartnell, Troughton, Pertwee. Obviously, I'd seen Baker before, but that was a long time before that. 7 years is a long time. And of course, Davison as well. I did have kind of a fun experience when I met Peter Davison in Chicago TARDIS several years ago. And I kind of got to tell him he was kind of my first Doctor. And he's like, oh, really? And I said, well, as much as any Doctor in the Five Doctors can claim to be, which he got a laugh out of.
Yeah, that's good. Just to back up for a moment, did you always have an affinity for British media, or did it Doctor Who springboard other fandoms? Because we know you through various cons, Con K, Spy Con, and we know you like all things British. So what came first?
What came first? In a way, I trace it back to the old Disney movie, The Great Mouse Detective, in a weird way, because that was one of my favorite Disney movies when I was a little kid, and it was my introduction in a roundabout way, I suppose, to Sherlock Holmes. I really, I guess, became a bit of an Anglophile through James Bond, talking about SpyCon. I got into that when I was 13. I caught Thunderball as part of what used to be called the ABC Bond Picture Show, because they used to show movies on Saturday night. And in 2002, they decided they were going to do, I think it was the first half of the James Bond film. So it was, all the Connery and Moore films, with the exception of Moonraker and A View to a Kill, weirdly enough. I don't know why they skipped those, but they did. But I think that was my introduction there. And sort of when that was sort of late middle school. In high school, I was introduced to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and I suppose that kind of opened some doors in a respect. So I think maybe I was sort of being primed for Doctor Who by the time I got to it. I really don't know.
That's interesting. And there are so many British shows available now to us in the United States.
Yeah, there was a time, 2007 was not that long ago, really, but it was at a time, at the time there wasn't a lot to choose from. And now, of course, I was really surprised the other day. I walked into my local Walmart here and, there's seasons of Downton Abbey and Sherlock and stuff available for sale. And it's like, how did this happen?
There's a lot. Well, and imagine how the popularity of Doctor Who has grown. I mean, with the new series that they've made, starting with number 9, and the popularity has just grown immensely. Yeah,
and I think that the availability of it on Netflix, and I think that the fact that Netflix, I think, was really the game changer. The whole streaming market was a game changer because you can now find, Netflix is co-producing shows with these British networks now, as is Amazon for that matter, are co-producing and distributing these British shows. And I think that has a lot to do with it as well. But I think Doctor Who kind of opened a lot of doorways for people to get into the wider sort of British film and TV culture. And that's at least certainly true for me. I wouldn't have got into things like Quatermass and Blake 7, a lot of the British stuff I've gotten into, even some of the non-sci-fi stuff that I got into. Yeah, there's a great late 80s political thriller called A Very British Coup that I discovered through a note in the info text listing on a classic Doctor Who DVD. So it's just kind of weird the way it just kind of, it was a gateway drug to British television, for lack of a better way of putting it, I suppose.
Well, even StarPodLog magazine, they went into depth about Doctor Who in issue number 23. They actually had an episode guide. What did you think about that article about Doctor Who in that issue of StarPodLog, Matt?
What's interesting looking back on that, I think with, we've got, 40 years of perspective is, it just shows you how different the culture was. There was a time when, I don't know if Doctor Who is necessarily a household name here in the U.S., but more often than not, you can mention it now and people will kind of know what you're talking about. And I think that Netflix has a lot to do with that. In the late 70s, that was certainly not the case. Doctor Who took a long time to kind of land here in the U.S. Weirdly enough, the first place in the U.S. you could have actually have watched Doctor Who at would have been if you were in like upstate New York or Vermont, anything along the Canadian border, because the William Hartnell stories, those first year or so of Hartnell was actually shown on Canadian television. So if you were on the border and you had your TV tuned just right, you could actually have watched William Hartnell. There's a wonderful book called Red, White, and Who that came out a couple of years ago that I do recommend for people who are interested in the history of Doctor Who in the U.S. and also the history of Doctor Who fandom here in the U.S. Because one of the interesting things that happened is that, as weird as it may sound, there's a strong possibility that a lot of Americans' introduction to Doctor Who wasn't even through the TV show. It was through the Peter Cushing Dalek movies that were made in the mid-'60s, because they were sold into a syndicated TV packaging at the end of the decade. So it's fun to imagine that there are probably people who were introduced through the kind of slightly campy and odd Peter Cushing movies. And then in the early 70s, it was sold here on PBS through PBS and also syndication through the Jon Pertwee episodes. It was sort of, I think, Spearhead from Space through to The Time Monster. And the problem with that is that I think there was an assumption by station owners and stuff that it was like any American show. You could show it out of order. Well, that's not how Doctor Who's made, especially in the classic era where it was a series of serials. So I've heard stories from people who watched, say, Spearhead from Space episode 1, and then you got The Sea Devils episode 4. Can you imagine suddenly going from the middle of one story into the middle of another story without really getting it?
So yeah, so you really should watch it in order, but they just didn't always show them in order.
Right. It took the late 70s, which is something that's talked about in that article, when Time Life bought the rights to, I think it's the first 3 or 4 Tom Baker seasons. So that's Robot through Talons of Weng Chiang, I think. And just to kind of show how high esteemed that the American audience was held through at the time, they brought in a wonderful actor named Howard Da Silva, who these days is probably best remembered for playing Ben Franklin in the musical 1776, and in its movie version of that as well. So he came in and did opening sort of linking narration at the beginning of every story and every episode, where it'd be kind of like, Doctor Who and Leela face off against the robots of death in a world where, there's nothing but sand and things like that. You can see some of that on some of the DVD releases. I think Pyramids of Mars has the linking narration that he did for that story on there. It was kind of like, there was kind of an assumption that I guess American audiences wouldn't be able to follow a series of serials. But clearly, the show was hugely successful here in the 80s, even going into the early 90s, which is ironically, of course, the time when the BBC pulled the plug on it. So clearly we could follow it, but it was just like for a few years it took a long time before anybody really thought that.
I think it was sort of an underground show. And according to the StarLog article, like it didn't come to the U.S. until like 78 or 79. And it started with Tom Baker, and I think that's how most people were introduced to Doctor Who. Yeah,
you talk to people of a certain age, for lack of a better way of putting it. Their memories are going to be Tom Baker through those showings. And as I said, Pertwee came before that. I think that's around 74, 75. But that was far more limited and stuff was shown out of order. The funny thing about the Pertwee stuff being shown is that today, of course, we have all these stories on DVD in wonderful color. At one point in the mid-late 70s, the BBC wiped a lot of the original color tapes of the Pertwee stories, and all they had in their archives were the black and white film copies that had been made to sell overseas, because believe it or not, there were still places in the late 70s, early 80s that were still showing things only in black and white. And one of the interesting things that happened was that American fans, even at that point when VHS tapes cost, $100, $200, were already beginning to record episodes off their PBS stations or local TV stations. There's a number of Pertwee stories, including the Silurians, Ambassadors of Death, Terror of the Autons, Claws of Axos, and the Demons, which only exist in color because somebody here in the U.S. recorded the stuff onto videotape and then made those copies available to the BBC, where they could restore the picture and be able to sort of overlay the color from that onto their film copies.
Well, we are glad those still exist, though.
Indeed.
So let's say, besides meeting Peter Davison, were there any other experiences you have in Doctor Who fandom that stand out to you?
Oh, wow. Being involved with a lot of the convention stuff over the last few years, I think, has been a big part of it. I've been involved with Conquistadores here in Alabama since 2012. I've had a lot of great experiences with that. I've been fortunate enough through that to interview on stage Peter Davison, Colin Baker, Paul McGann, Eric Roberts and his wife, Jason Hayellery, who's the executive producer of Big Finish. Who else have I talked to? Yeah, and Gareth David Lloyd, Katrin Stewart, Neve McIntosh, who is a hoot for anybody who's never met her. So I've had a lot of great experiences that way. I think my favorite experience, though, kind of connected to all that, is in 2016, I was involved with a Shakespeare company here in Huntsville that sadly is no longer going. And I had the great fortune of getting together a group of actors I knew from that, and we did a staged reading of The Power of the Daleks, an adaptation of it, the great lost Patrick Troughton story. So we got to actually do that live on stage at the con. complete with Dalek voices that a brilliant young gentleman was able to come up with a digital ring modulator so we could do that. I'd hoped to do a full stage version of that, but wouldn't you know, about 3 months after the con, the BBC announced they were going to animate the whole story, so go figure. But that's probably my favorite experience, was getting to recreate that lost story.
That's great.
Yeah, it sounds like everyone would have loved to have seen it.
It is on YouTube. You can see the reading on YouTube. Somebody who was in the audience, Jason Chong, put it up on YouTube. So if you look up Power of the Daleks on stage, you should be able to find it. I think he uploaded it in 3 parts.
Great. Yeah, we'll have to look it up.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.